Hi everyone, welcome to this class. So we're going to paint this Christmas cookie. It's covered in chocolate. And I did this test piece on the side. It's not done yet. I didn't remove the masking fluid, but just to give you an idea of like how I'm going to paint it. So the first step was to kind of strip down this cookie from chocolate. So you forget about the chocolate and you just think about the colors of the cookie or the dough. So I used raw sienna, I used yellow ochre, burnt sienna, some quinacridone red, just tiny bit. And I applied the colors wet on wet. So basically the whole cookie, I'm not thinking about the chocolate part. It's just all that part right here. And I'm also painting all this part. Then once this dries, that's when I add the shadows next to the cookie. And of course, shadow is optional. If you don't want the shadow, that's fine too. And then once this dries, once this layer dries, that's when I apply the masking fluid for watercolors. And that's for all the walnuts or whatever nuts there are. And then that has to dry because it's masking fluid. And once the masking fluid is dry, that's when I can start working on that second layer, but this is chocolate. This time just the chocolate. Now we do have highlights. These are the highlights. I painted it very fast, but the idea is to actually have a little more blue in those highlights. And we want to have that as like an undertone. So to begin with that, and I will guide you through in this class, but for the chocolate, you can use burnt sienna like I did, or I will, and imidazolone brown. Those are like the two main browns. Plus I added some red, quinacridone red, and I still added a little bit of cobalt blue and quinacridone red with it, which is like a blue violet, because whenever you mix blue with red, you create a shade of violet. So if you treat that as one, then it's just a blue violet. You can also use a different color, but I suggest to combine two to create that blue violet. And then, so I add that to the browns, and so browns of your choice. And if you want to make it more reddish, then you add more red. If you want to make it more brownish, you can add more burnt sienna. The imidazolone brown is already like reddish brown, but I also added some Van Dyck brown. So I'm going to put this on the side. This is still drying. I'm not done with it yet. This is also Honey Mule D Collection watercolor paper. And the paper I'm going to use for this class is the Collection watercolor paper by Honey Mule, and this is cold pressed. So the first step is actually to have your colors ready on your palette. So you want to have them diluted with water ahead of time, and then we'll begin wetting the cookie. So the colors I'm going to dilute with water are, I have here yellow ochre, I have raw sienna, quinacridone red, some burnt sienna, and that's all I need at the beginning because I'm just focusing on that cookie dough. So now my colors are diluted with water to a consistency that I like to say like heavy cream-like ratio. So think of dairy and try to picture heavy cream, because I don't want the colors to be more diluted with water since the paper is going to be wet. So now this is my long quill size 2 songbird brush. This one is my own line, and it's made in Germany by Da Vinci. So I'm wetting the cookie. Again, I'm forgetting about that chocolate part, right? So I'm not thinking about the chocolate. And let's see, I marked for myself like some extra parts that are sticking out of the cookie. I don't have to touch those. I just want to paint that cookie. And if there's pieces of chocolate that are sticking out, I'm gonna actually leave it alone for now. So the process of wetting is, it just depends. Sometimes it will be like, let's say 5 minutes, sometimes 2 minutes. You just really want to make sure the paper is nice and wet. And for something like this, you really want to use a good watercolor paper, good quality. And this is my favorite, the Collection, and I do suggest this paper because you can add layers easily. So with this paper, I'll be able to re-wet sections or even the entire cookie and add an additional layer. Otherwise, if you use a different type of a paper, you might end up lifting colors. So I do suggest the Collection watercolor paper. So I'm just wetting, and the wetting process does take some time, so you never want to just do it quickly, fast, and just get it over with. You want to treat it as you're painting, like the same way, because the longer you wet the paper, the more time you have to apply the colors wet and wet. Now with my test piece, I was kind of in a hurry because I wasn't recording, and I just wanted to see like how I'm going to layer it and to kind of break it down into stages to make it as easy to understand as possible. So less spontaneous and more planned for the class. So my paper is nice and wet. I've been wetting for like 3 minutes. I don't mind waiting for another minute actually. It's just to make sure that this is all nice and wet. There's just different techniques. For example, like if I was painting the background as well and I didn't preserve any areas to stay paper dry, then I would just wet the backside of the paper. But in this case, there's no need for that because I'm just painting this cookie. That's it. So might as well just take my time here and just wet as long as I feel like wetting, basically, because then I'll have more time to apply the colors wet on wet. Now you don't want to go over the edges because if you do, then the paint will bleed there too. So that's why. So this is good. Now the first colors are going to be the lightest colors, and we're thinking about the cookie anyway, and the cookie itself is pretty light. So I like to use yellow ochre, then some raw sienna. You don't have to use both, it's just that I have both and I like both, right? But you don't need it. And then tiny bit of red, and in my case this is quinacridone red. And you want to fill it out. So you place that color and you kind of feel it out, like how it's spreading. And of course, if the paper is too wet, the paint will spread too much. But it's okay. Just try not to grab any more water with your brush. Just go for the paint. So what I try to grab is more like a, let's say, half and half like ratio, right? Between water and paint, because at this stage, at this point, I do want the paint to spread. So think half and half like coffee creamer, the creamer for your coffee, right? And so you want some paint to spread. But then when you want to have more control, that's when you want to go heavier with the ratio between water and paint, which means less and less water mixed with that paint. And that matters greatly when you paint with watercolors, because it's all about that ratio between water and paint. So for now, this is a very like a light value right now, what you see, but I'm going to grab tiny more of the quin red with the tip of my brush. And there's the yellow ochre, some raw sienna, right? So this might be a little more reddish. So if it's more reddish, I'm going to find those more reddish areas on the cookie. And let's remember, this is a cookie, right? It's baked. So that means the edges would be more like brownish or yellowish. Those would be more baked, cooked. So the edges need to have a little more color. And in this case, I'm just going to add some burnt sienna in just a second. Right now, because I have a quill, I hold a lot of water and paint, so it just depends what brush you're using. But when I press harder, I release more of the paint from the brush because I still have plenty here. Now, what do we do about these highlights that we see over chocolate, right? Because that's something we could right away think about. So in a second, I'm going to add a little bit of cobalt blue, but for now, I'm not ready yet. I want to have actually the paint that's more diluted with water. So it's kind of like, I guess it feels more like a milk-like ratio. And why is that? It's, again, because I do want the paint to still spread. Like I don't need as much control yet. And please notice, like, I'm not just going across the cookie with a brush. I'm choosing areas where I'm applying colors. Yes, I'm going mostly like towards the edges because those are the nice and baked sides, like more crispy. And spreading the paint. And if you feel like you have too much paint in one area, then you want to kind of move it, push it to some other area. Because once you have the paint on the paper, that doesn't mean that you just have to leave it and let it dry just the way it is. No, you can manipulate the paint. You can decide how things are going to dry. Now here, I don't kind of play as much. It's just kind of, you can't see really what's underneath the chocolate, but we can get an idea from what we see here, right? But I do want some color there because then I'll have like some layer of a color already there, and it'll be easier to tackle this when I come to painting the chocolate. So just kind of dab on the paper too, like if the areas are a little too light, for example. But you want this to be uneven. You don't want this to be even. You want this layer to feel like uneven in a way. And then if it's too much of a color in some area, you can kind of grab it with the brush, push it, move it, just kind of play with it so you can manipulate that paint how it's going to dry. So I think I'm good here. So what I'm going to do is clean this brush. I don't need this brush at the second. So I'm going to clean it in the cleaner water. I have 3 jars here. And I'm going to grab actually a brush that I have a little more control. So this is actually a stiffer brush and it has a finer point, right? So this is my round 8. Now I'm going to grab this time some of the burnt sienna. Now I didn't really dilute it with water, but here it is. So this is my burnt sienna. What I'm trying to grab is actually heavy cream-like ratio between water and paint, and then some of the raw sienna here. And then if I want tiny bit of quin red. Now, how do we go like about mixing colors, right? I always say to mix colors on your painting versus in your palette. And that's because you avoid the muddiness of colors. And when you're mixing colors, like too much on your palette, you won't see much of that separation of colors. You do want the colors to actually separate on your paint, on your paper in your painting, because then it will look more natural. Because, for example, you're using blue and red, right? So blue violet. If you create that perfect color mix on your palette, you just mix and mix those 2 colors together, so blue, red. Okay, you create that shade of purple or violet, that's fine. But it will look more natural if it's not mixed that well on the palette, in your palette. But you actually let these colors to separate, because that'll look, it will look more natural. That's because the light and shadows affect the object differently, so the color will, the shade of a color will change. It just depends how the light and shadows affect that object. Now I'm grabbing some more of the burnt sienna. Now if you take a look at the reference, you have a chocolate and then you have the cookie dough. Next to that chocolate, you can see like it's a little more like there's like a color that's almost underneath the, or next to that chocolate. It just feels like there should be some brown. So I'm just creating like a line here. Now the paper is drying, and I mentioned about adding the bluish undertones for the highlights. So I kind of have to work faster. That's what I mean. Faster. I have to go a little faster about this. So I can do this before the paper dries. Now, what you might also notice is that I'm actually traveling from the areas a lot. So I'm moving from one area to another. And that's exactly to keep the paper wet longer. So I just grabbed a little bit of heavy cream-like ratio between water and paint of just the raw sienna. So I want this part to be a little more brownish here. So I'm grabbing even like a cream top-like ratio. So think of the paint that's just squeezed out of a tube. So it'll be a little thicker, right? Creamy. So that's what I want. And I can still apply it like here too, even I don't see these edges because these are like darker anyway. So might as well just add some burnt sienna here and there, right? Now I do want to grab that cobalt blue quickly. And if I can't do it now, that's okay, I'll do it later. So a little bit of quin red here, and then there's my cobalt blue. So this is like it's a little too diluted paint with water, so I need to do it again. So it's not so diluted, because I want this to be more like a heavy cream. Because, why is that? Because the paper is drying, and I'm gonna wipe my brush. I have a little too much on my brush. If the paper is drying, like you have to feel it out what ratio works better at the moment. Because if you have too much water, then you create bloom very easily. I just want a little bit of a violet there in those highlights. So I don't even know where the highlights are here, because I kind of marked it, but it's hard to see, to be honest. But there's those bigger highlights which are here. If you have too much paint, just go over that area again. Just kind of push the paint, and remember that this will dry lighter than what you see right now, because watercolors always dry more like lighter than what we first see on the watercolor paper when things are still wet, right? So now, since I did that, I can go back to the cookie here with a damp brush. So this is important. The brush has to be damp. So like you have to wipe your brush first on a towel, and then you can still manipulate things how they're drying. If let's say you want to add more paint or anything, then you do want to go with that cream top-like ratio. Now here, I want this to spread less. So I'm kind of going through it, kind of manipulating the paint again. That's all I'm doing. And this is pretty nice. It looks good already with those crispier edges. Now I'm not going to add the Van Dyke brown actually towards, like, we have these lines, right, when in the reference image. And I'm not gonna do that until this is dry, and that's when I can start playing with it more. So what I could do though is grab a smaller brush. Let's say I could grab either a regular brush or a really small brush. This is my round 2, it's a stiffer brush, and you can grab with the tip of your brush dry paint. It's not dry actually, scratch that. This is like, imagine paint that's just like squeezed out of a tube. So that's what I call cream top like ratio. And because this is still wet, you can leave like little dots, but because the paper is wet, right, and you're using that cream top like ratio, so it's like thicker paint, the paint is not spreading as much. It's just very like not much at all. It's just small dots, wherever you want to place that. We don't have to add these lines, the shadows yet, just to add some dots, right? Maybe there's some vanilla in there or something. And then I'm grabbing a little more of that cream top like ratio between wet and paint of the burnt sienna, just a burnt sienna. And I didn't clean my brush, so technically I still have Van Dyke brown on my brush. And I'm going to grab again the burnt sienna right in here. And then I want to add it actually in here. So I'm doing this because the paper is still wet. It's not perfectly wet because I can see like this is actually too dry for me. But I want to add something extra, like some dots or some lines. So if I want to do that, to add some texture, then I'm going to do that now. And I think this is fine. Like, I don't need to do too much to it. Since I have some paint, I'm just going to place it right here. But this is the area where I actually want to add some or use masking fluid for watercolors. And then just some dots. There you go. So I'm going to clean the brush. And I just have to walk away from this and let it dry. I can't do anything to it. Hi everyone, so while I was waiting for my layer to dry, I actually finished this one. So I removed the masking fluid and then I applied like raw sienna, quinacridone red, some burnt sienna, yellow ochre for the nuts, right? So now we are actually ready to apply the masking fluid towards our cookie in this class. And you can decide whatever you want these nuts, the toppings. You can add as much as you want or as little as you want, or you don't even have to add it at all. So I'm going to apply the masking fluid towards those areas, so whatever I have marked for myself, but also I'm just going to glance up at the reference image. So this is the masking I'm going to use. It's just Raczynska blue masking fluid, and I need to shake it first. Now I'm going to use a regular brush. This is a synthetic brush, so if you use a brush for masking fluid, I suggest to use a stiff synthetic brush, because I have no issues with this one, and it's just a regular, it's a cheaper brush. And as long as it's a stiffer brush and it's synthetic, then I don't have issues. So I'm just going to grab some masking, and right after I'm done applying, I'm going to let this to dry. So I want some masking here, whatever I feel like adding some toppings to the cookie. Whatever you feel like adding those nuts, the walnuts, I guess those are walnuts. And I'm going to add some here too. And then I'm going to add a shadow right underneath once this dries. And then I'm going to find another one right in here, for example. Now, we can also add masking, I was just thinking, towards the highlighted areas, so you don't have to worry about them. So I'm going to do that right now too. So this is one of these highlights. If your masking fluid feels too thick, from my experience, what you can do is add water to it. So I added water to my masking, but it feels still too thick a little bit. Now these highlights need to be extremely smooth. So the edges need to be very smooth. So no dry brushing, just a nice smooth lines. I'm gonna find a couple more highlights, such as here. And I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking about my brush. Is it gonna get ruined from masking? No, it does not get damaged from the masking. I've been using the same brush for the last 4 months now. It's just a stiffer brush, and from my experience, as long as you use like a stiff brush, not a soft brush, then you're just fine. You can easily remove that masking fluid. but you gotta go right away. You don't want the masking to dry, right? So you gotta go to whatever you need to clean the brush. So I'm gonna go to the bathroom in a second, and I'm going to clean this brush with warm water and soap, and that's enough. That's all I need to do. So whatever I have highlights, that's where I'm using this masking. And it looks like I will be removing all of it at once. So I won't be able to separate like the highlights from the toppings because it's all touching each other, like the elements. They're all touching each other. So something like that. And that's it. So I'm gonna run quickly to the bathroom to clean my brush. But we have to, I guess, wait for this to dry. In the meantime, we can start working on shadows. So I'm back, and just to show you, to prove the point that you can use a brush, this is the same brush I was just using, and it's perfectly clean. So it was very easy to clean it because I didn't let any of the masking to dry on it. So I'm going to place it on the side because I don't need this right now. And what I'm going to do is focus on applying the shadows. So right here, we have a shadow here, 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 and here. So we have these shadows, and I'm going to use some browns. So the colors that I've used already for the cookie dough, for the cookie itself, and that's like the raw sienna, some of the yellow ochre, burnt sienna, with an addition of cobalt blue, so my blue violet, and let's say maybe some burnt sienna to make it darker. So these are all neutral colors. If you want to learn more about like how to create natural looking shadows, I have a video on my YouTube channel, and this is where you want to refer to a color wheel and use complementary colors. These are of course more like neutral colors. It's a little different, but you still want to use some of the primary colors in your color blend that you're going to use for the shadows. So let's get to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is wet the section underneath this part of the cookie. So I'm going to wet more than I need to, because just in case like the paint might spread a little more, and plus I just want to feel comfortable with it. And then I'm going to just keep going down like this. So next it's going to be this part, and then over here, then over here, over here, over here, over here. So I'm going to start with this part right here. I'm using a round brush size 8, but I will switch to a smaller brush. And this is like the area also where you could technically add some chocolate there later if you want to. So I might omit some of that area, and I do have masking fluid, which kind of helps to stay away from that area, from the cookie itself. Right here, not over here, where I'm just adding water now. So what colors? I'm going to start with a little bit of the raw sienna that I used for the cookie itself, and then some burnt sienna, yellow ochre. And then on top of that, I'm going to add some of the cobalt blue and quinacridone red. And whenever you mix yellow, blue, red together, you create a shade of gray. And then it's just a matter of how much blue you add to it, or yellow, or red, to determine if it's a yellow gray, blue gray, or red gray. So here I'm almost ready. I don't want to add too much water because I don't want the paint to spread that much, and I don't need to wet it too long. However, of course, if I don't wet it too long, then I'm not going to have that much time to apply the colors wet on wet. I went a little too far. It's okay if I do anyway, because actually this is where I'm going to apply colors for the chocolate, so it's going to be darker, but I still want to stay away for the most part. So there it is. There's the spot. I'm going to switch to a smaller brush, round 2, stiffer brush, and I'm going to grab the same colors, but the ratio needs to be more like a cream top-like ratio between water and paint. So that's because I don't want the paint to spread too much. So first, I do have some of that raw sienna, and raw sienna, some quin red, let's say. Raw sienna, quin red. It's hard to kind of see actually if you look at the reference image what colors or where we have them, right? That's why I'm going for the neutrals. I start with a little bit of yellow, and then on top of that I'm adding this quinacridone red with cobalt blue and some burnt sienna too, and the yellows. And I'm just placing this shadow. And I'm going to grab a little bit of the browns that I'm going to use for the chocolate too, which is Van Dyke brown and some of the imidazzolone brown, because those colors would be reflecting over as well. So just to make this part a little darker, and that's it. I'm going to clean this brush. So the round 2 is going to be cleaned up. And that's all I needed to do, because even I wet it way more than I needed, right? That's just in case. And I'm gonna do the same thing here. So I'm just wetting this. It looks like I designated another area. I guess it's for the chocolate, but this is about a shadow. So I'm gonna stay away from the chocolate. I actually did it very fast in my test piece, but here I want to take my time. So not too much water. Of course, you can go through this area a couple times just to make sure it doesn't dry too fast. And then I'm starting with this raw sienna here. There's some quin red in there too. I'm trying to grab more like a cream top like ratio, between wood and paint. I went a little over, but it's okay. Again, this is going to be chocolate, so I don't have to worry too much. But here, this is cream top like ratio between wood and paint, so the paint just doesn't spread much. And then with that same brush, I didn't clean it. I'm grabbing quin red, cobalt blue. And I grab some of the browns that I'm going to use as well, just to make it a little darker. And then the darkest part is here in this little corner. Now it's hard to, again, tell like how the shadow goes because we have that chocolate there everywhere pretty much. But it's just to get an idea here, to give an idea like how it's just basically in the corner right there. And then I do have that chocolate here, but I'm just going to add way more color even over there. And I'm going to clean this brush, wipe it on a towel. And then I have a damp brush. So I'm just going to do this, and then it feels like I need a little more of the blue. So I just grabbed some more of the cobalt blue here, and I just placed it right there. Now I'm going to clean the brush, wipe it on a towel again, and I'm going to go for the shadows on the bottom now. So shadows on the bottom, starting from the left side. So I'm just going to wet it right in here, right underneath the cookie, and hopefully this all dries fast so I can start working on the chocolate. There you go. So this is going to be my first one on the bottom here. And technically I could do it with this brush, but I think I'm just going to stick to a smaller brush. So round 2 again, mostly the raw sienna here. And this one is easier to see, like the shadow. So we go all the way to the cookie. So there's a little bit of that yellow there, and then we can start adding the browns with some of the quin red, cobalt blue, and then maybe some Van Dyke brown too. And right underneath, right there. Right there. But the area that's closest towards the cookie needs to be the darkest. So if you need to make it darker, you want to grab that cream top like ratio between water and paint of that quin red and cobalt blue. And I have a hard time grabbing cream top because everything is a little too diluted with water. So I'm just kind of placing it on the side a little bit. And there it is. Now you can see it's a cream top like ratio between water and paint. I just want this shadow to be really dark. I'm actually going to go a little bit inside the cookie right there, just like we see in the reference image. And that's it. And then if you need to polish it, if you need to do anything with the cookie or the shadow, I'm sorry, you just go through it with the damp brush. Now I'm adding a little bit of a yellow just because I don't feel enough of that yellow like I see in the reference. So just a little more of that raw sienna. But this is the polishing I was talking about. You just go kind of through it with that damp brush, and then clean the brush. I'm going to wipe it on a towel now. And I'm going to go with that damp brush right underneath so the paint doesn't spread too much. There you go. I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the bottom here on this one. So underneath this cookie here. So I'm just wetting it. Just wetting it. Perfect. And now the same thing starting with the raw sienna. Starting with the raw sienna, and I could grab this yellow ochre too. I just keep grabbing mostly raw sienna, but you can definitely grab the raw sienna or yellow ochre together. It's up to you. And then grabbing this quin red with the browns and follow or the cobalt blue. There you go. And going right next to underneath this part of the cookie. And the darkest part of the shadow will be right there, right the area where we're touching the cookie. Now I think I need to match it a little more to that one, so I'm going to make it a little more purple. So I just grab more of the cobalt blue with the quin red. and adding it right there. So there's my next shadow. Wiping the brush first on a towel, and this is the another area right in here. Now this shadow kind of like starts here, and it kind of ends right here. So I don't need to wet too far out there. Plus I just wetted these areas, so I don't want to really touch those areas. I don't want to send any paint or water in those directions here. There you go. And then the same thing, starting with that raw sienna. My raw sienna is not that clean. I have a little color there. I can tell it's like a quin red, let's say. So just a little bit of that, and it's fine. It doesn't bother me at all. And right underneath this part of the cookie. And then I'm gonna grab this cream top-like ratio between water and paint of that cobalt blue, some quin red, and then grab also like some Van Dyke brown, for example, or even burnt sienna. So that's that, and actually I need a little more color here. Maybe I will grab even more of the Van Dyke brown with the tip of my brush, going as close as I can right underneath here, or this cookie here, right there. Because the area that touches the immediately that touches the cookie, that should be the darkest part. And then we just move to the next area, which is right in here. So this is the next part of the cookie. Actually, not this part, but this part needs a shadow. So this one is actually easier too. The ones on the left side were not that easy. That's because we have a chocolate there. So it's kind of there covered a little bit. So there you go. Some water there, and then I'm gonna start the same thing with the same thing. So this is mostly raw sienna, a little bit of quin red, and I'm starting with that, but then I'm gonna add the darks, right? So here we go, and then let's grab some of that violet. Violet, when I say blue, violet, that's the mix of my blue with red, which is cobalt blue, and some of the quin red. And this shadow is kind of like that, so I don't really need to work too much on it. I do want to make it a little darker, so I'm grabbing a little more of those colors, plus so the cobalt blue, quin red, and some Van Dyke brown. And I do need to work on this part, the edge anyway, because that needs that crispy part of, or whatever that is on the other side of the cookie. Because what we see is actually just the dough here, and then we have the chocolate, but I don't know what's underneath that. And then I have a little more of the cobalt blue quin red. Actually, I want to go over here, over the cookie a little bit, and make this line right here a little more like darker, but also to touch the sides of the cookie. So right there. Actually, I could do that here, but it's a little too late because this has already dried. So I'm going to clean this brush, wipe it on a towel. And this one right here has actually chocolate coming off right here. So you know what? Just like I did in my test piece, I'm actually do the same thing because I kind of like it the way it is. But just in case, I guess if you're not thinking about adding that piece of the chocolate that's melted down and you want to add a shadow, you want to do it the same thing. You want to do it the same way. You just kind of, I guess I can do it. Why not to do it? So even if you change your mind, let's say, and so you're adding this shadow like I am right now, but then you're changing your mind later and decide to add the chocolate, melted chocolate right here, you can still do that because the shadow itself is kind of like similar colors to that melted part of the chocolate. So it's okay to have this layer on the bottom here. And I'm gonna start right here with the raw sienna. So there's my raw sienna. I'm kind of following the bottom part, how to spread the shadow. And then the three colors mostly, which is the cobalt blue, quin red, and some of the Van Dyke brown. So I'm kind of following the one that I just did below because I can't see much what's happening here. So, and that's it for this shadow. And I do have to wait for this to dry because the shadows are too wet to start working on the chocolate. One thing I could do is grab this round brush size 2, and this is my burnt sienna, and just add those shadows right here next to the masking fluid. I do have masking fluid there. And now I'm going to grab with the tip of my brush, like a cream top-like ratio between water and paint of the burnt sienna and Van Dyke brown. So at first it was just the burnt sienna, and now it's burnt sienna and Van Dyke brown. And that will give me a nice kind of like a shadow there. And I really want to do more to this, but I can't. I just have to wait for this to dry, for these shadows to dry. And then once this is dry, then I can start working on the chocolate, the first layer for the chocolate. And we have preserved a lot of areas, so we don't have to worry about it. So we can just easily just go through it and add that first layer of the chocolate. So let's walk away from it and let it dry. Hi everyone, so I'm back. I have Van Dyke brown, burnt sienna, imidazolone brown, cobalt blue, corn red, indigo that I'm going to use for that chocolate blend, right? So just like I mentioned earlier, like it's not about really mixing those colors in your palette, it's about mixing colors on the paper. But how do we go about having like this chocolate, right? We can see the color. We still want to see the separation of colors. So we want to slightly blend them on the palette until it looks more like the chocolate. Like here's my test piece. So you can see like the separation of colors, and you can definitely see I use some of the burnt sienna in there. There's some imidazolone yellow, or not yellow, but brown. And this is also like 2 layers. We can just go with 1 layer if we want to keep it really light. So because we have masking fluid, we don't have to worry about like preserving those areas to stay light for the toppings, and then plus the highlights. So the next thing you want to do is squeeze some of the colors onto your palette. So you want to have like a burnt sienna like brown, so like kind of like a reddish brown. Then you also want to have a red. I have quin red, but you could use different red, like pearl red would be fine too. Then I have additionally imidazolone brown. Now you don't have to use this shade of brown. This is actually very like chocolatey brown, so this works well for like the lightest areas that you see over the chocolate. And then to make things darker, that's when I want to use Van Dyke brown with blue violet. My blue violet is cobalt blue and quin red, so it's like a quick blend, as you see, because you can still see quin red there, and then unmixed cobalt blue. So those are the colors. So I'm going to place these on the side. And because we used masking fluid for watercolors to cover these highlights and the toppings, then we don't have to go actually wet on dry. We could easily just go wet on wet without worrying that we just wet the areas. So it's up to you how comfortable you feel with wet on wet, because again, you could just paint the chocolate right now wet on dry as well, just like I did in my first test piece. So what I'm going to do is grab a smaller brush. I'm going to grab a round 8. This is my round 8 golden tube brush. It's a softer brush. I'm going to make sure this is nicely wet brush, so it has enough water. I'm going to start wetting. So my technique is always like wet on wet is wet first, and then if anything I'll do something wet on dry. It's just the way I feel about wet on wet. I prefer wet on wet versus wet on dry. I feel more comfortable with it. However, like wet on dry, sometimes it's easier and sometimes it's not compared to the wet on wet. It just depends what we're doing when we're painting. So here we're just wetting the tree, but again, you could just start applying colors wet on dry. And the difference would be ratio that you would be using between water and paint. So if you're doing this wet on dry right now, you're applying the colors for the chocolate and you're mixing colors on the paper, right? So you're grabbing those colors and then slightly applying them, starting with the lightest colors first, and then you're building up like the darks. But you would go with the ratio that I call between water and milk-like ratio, so it would be a little lighter. Now, I do have all these areas covered, which is pretty nice because I don't have to worry about it, but I still have to think about highlights. I'm going to go over here a little bit because I do have the masking. And the same thing here, like I have masking fluid, so I might as well just go through this part. Here I don't, so I'm just going to keep that separate. And there's my chocolate, the end of the chocolate is right here. And here, got to be careful. So you want to use a brush you feel comfortable with. when you apply the colors, I'm gonna use the softer brush. If you want to have more control, you can go with the stiffer brush. Just remember that whenever we work with stiffer brushes, like we have to be more gentle once we apply the colors, because with a stiffer brush, it's easier to remove the color, for example. I'm going to zoom in so you can see things much easier here. So I just continue wetting. I continue wetting, even though like I already have like enough water that has, it feels like there's enough water that's been absorbed. And it's kind of hard to see too sometimes because of the masking, but I'm still going to give it another few seconds here. And then if I have too much water, I'm just gonna remove it with a brush, or for now, I'm just gonna kind of move it around. And I'm going to start with the lightest colors first without like adding yet the Van Dyke brown and blue violet, which is my cobalt blue and quinacridone red. So I could actually grab some of the raw sienna, like before we used raw sienna, right? Just a little bit. And then there is my burnt sienna. And then there is imidazolone brown. So I could just start with these, but I feel like I do want some of that burnt sienna, not burnt sienna, but raw sienna. It feels right. And very quickly, I'm just grabbing colors. This is heavy cream-like ratio between water and paint. So I'm gonna start, I guess, right in here. And then you start applying colors, feel it out. Like you don't need to apply color everywhere. Just kind of dab on the paper. See how it spreads. And we're not reaching for the darks yet. Here's the area on the outside a little bit. We're not going for the darks yet. These are mid-tones for now. Just to apply colors. And you do want to see the separation of colors. This is my raw sienna, burnt sienna, and some Van Dyke brown. So again, I'm not trying to mix colors on my palette. It all needs to happen here, right here on the paper. And that's to avoid the muddiness of colors. That's number one. But number two is because I want to see the separation of colors. There you go. Some chocolate there. And we could definitely do this with 2 layers. I'm thinking we might have to actually, because we have this masking, we don't really see what's going to happen. Like once we remove the masking, we have an idea of what's going to happen. Because whenever we remove masking fluid, you have bright white paper under that and you have hard edges. So most of the time I just have to soften those edges. But that will be for sure our second layer. Here I'm going to add a little bit of that color going over the edge here. So these are the lighter parts. So I could actually start adding the darks. A lot of times, I'm not sure if I'm going to add second layer or not. My goal overall, this is actually way more concentrated imidazolone brown with some burnt sienna. So more like a cream top, or actually between heavy cream and cream top, like ratio between water and paint, what I grabbed. And I'm just kind of aiming for the darker areas now. But a lot of times, I just don't know if I'm going to add that second layer or not. A little more of that cream top like ratio between water and paint of that imidazolone brown, and then I just grab this burnt sienna because I want to mix colors on this paper versus my palette. That's the main goal. That's what I want. And then actually I'm gonna go over here a little bit just to show that there's chocolate going that way. And then here too, because I have masking, so automatically like the paint won't go there. It's just a little bit of a chocolate that went over here, and then the same thing here. Why not to go over a little bit right there? And what else we have that actually, it could be like here too, just to add a little bit. However, there's a highlight that I should have probably preserved more of that to stay paper all light, but it's okay. So here, this is the important part now. Let's grab this burnt sienna, dilute it more to heavy cream. There's my Van Dyke brown, and now I'm going to grab this violet. So now the shade of that brown changes. It's becoming like, it looks richer now. Now I have to really hurry because I thought I wetted this paper long enough, but I guess I didn't. So everything is drying super fast. So now where am I placing these darks, the darker tones that I can see? It's mostly towards like the darkest areas, if you can see those darkest areas. So they're not the same as before. Before I was looking for like the mid-tones, right? I was actually applying colors towards the darkest areas, but I was thinking more like to have the light values over some of these lighter areas as well. This is more like just the darks, and so I'm going to apply color with that between heavy cream and cream top like ratio. So the ratio between water and paint towards the darkest areas that I can see. I hope this is not too confusing. So right now we're looking for the darkest areas in that chocolate, and that's where we're applying Van Dyke Brown, Amy Along Brown, Burnt Sienna, and some of this blue violet. It's like a quick mix of the blue and cobalt blue and quin red together. And this is cream template ratio because I want to have a lot of control. Now I need to have it even darker a little bit. So I'm gonna dig into this mix here. This is cobalt blue, the quin red, and going for the darkest areas again once more. And of course I can easily add another layer here. So I will think about it once this dries, and then I will know what I want to do. Right now, I think everything is fine. It's just that there is a difference between like what things look like now when the paper is still wet. The colors are different, right? Everything looks richer, what I'm trying to say, compared to once the paper, everything dried. Then suddenly it's not as vibrant anymore. So what I'm going to do is continue a little bit more here, and I'm gonna grab a smaller brush because another thing we need to consider is actually adding shadows under these toppings. So we can do that later once this dries, but if we can, like, let's say catch it before it's already too like before it's too dry, then we can still add cream top light ratio between water and paint with a small brush, the same colors but really concentrated paint, and so we have like shadows underneath those toppings. So more, and then I decided to mix in a little bit of indigo, just a little bit of indigo, place it towards the darks. I can do it, I guess, with a round brush 8 too, just to add the darks next to those toppings. So it just depends how much control you want to have, but I will still switch. It's just right now, since I already have this indigo mixed in with those colors, might as well just keep going a little more. So I'm going to clean this brush now, and I'm grabbing this stiffer brush, a size 2. It's a smaller brush, size 2. And what I'm going to do is grab this Van Dyke Brown thick paint. So this is just this paint straight out of a tube, basically. And let's see, let's go here where we have this cobalt blue and some of the quin red, and then we can grab a little bit of indigo too to make it a little darker. But if it feels like too dark and you don't feel like there's enough of brown, then just grab more brown and grab this thicker paint. So this is like with on the tip of my brush, cream template ratio between water and paint, and I'm just aiming right underneath these toppings. Now it might be a little hard because it seems like I just have so much color already there that the paint is kind of doesn't want to, well, first of all, you don't want it to spread much. That's why we're using this cream top. But even I'm using this cream top, you can't really see much. There's a tiny bit of the difference, but I want to see more of that. So I might have to just do it later, once the paper dries. So with that third layer, I'd say. So that would be like a technically third layer. And just underneath those toppings. If I can't do it now, great. If not, then it's no big deal. I'll just do it later. Just a couple areas here and there. Just to add a little more darks, like those darker tones underneath these toppings. So it's like a shadow. So we'll work on it more later. So right now, we just have to wait for this to dry. So everything is wet, and we still have like masking fluid and stuff like that. So that's something like we can't be done until we remove the masking and we work on those highlights. That's one thing. And also we have these toppings. So that's another thing we have to layer. So those are going to be very light colors. So like raw sienna, yellow ochre, maybe some burnt sienna for the toppings. So let's work away from it and let it dry. Hi everyone, so everything has dried, the chocolate is dry, and just by looking at it right now, I feel like I have enough of that color in there. However, in some areas I might need to add color. For example, maybe next to the toppings. So we'll get to that in a second. The first thing I actually want to do is add lines here. So there's a little like darker areas over the cookie. So I'm going to use for that a smaller brush, and first of all I do need my paint to be a little diluted with water. So this is my Van Dyke brown here. I actually have a little bit of gold in it. I was just adding some gold accent to a different painting, and it looks like I'm going to have some gold in my cookie as well now. But this is my imidazzle brown. I don't really need it for this piece. It's more about like burnt sienna and I'd say Van Dyke brown. So I'm just diluting it with water. And this is going to be painted wet on dry, which means I need to adjust that ratio between water and paint. So what I want to grab is more like between water and milk-like ratio. So this is my Van Dyke brown and burnt sienna. And because I'm right-handed, I'm going to go this way. So I'm going to start right in here. So it's just like a darker line, but I need way more color. And you know what? I am going to add some of this reddish brown, which is imidazzle brown as well. So it's just to add it like right above there. And it's nice to have the three colors. Again, you're not trying to mix colors on your palette. You're trying to just quickly grab the colors, maybe quick swirl with the colors with that brush, right? But you actually are mixing colors on the paper. And so you do want to see the separation of colors. Here I'm adding a little more color here. And then let's go for this part right here. So more colors. Again, this is how I'm grabbing colors. I grabbed a little more water. Van Dyke brown, burnt sienna, and imidazzle brown. That's all I want to do. And then I'm going to start over here and kind of drag it all the way to here. And as a matter of fact, I need to make it a little darker, so I'm going to grab some of the Van Dyke brown. Now, I'm changing the ratio because this is wet now, so I want this to be more like a heavy cream when I'm adding now on top of this, because where this is already wet. So I'm adding color to a wet surface. Now this has dried, so this is fine if it's more like a milk-like ratio, which has become because I was touching like a wet area. You want to feel it out basically, because you don't want it to be too thick. I added a little more color there. Now we have a little bit of that over there as well. I'm gonna clean the brush actually. I was gonna say I'm not gonna clean it, but I'm gonna clean it. This is my burnt sienna, Van Dyke brown, and some of the imidazzle brown. I'm gonna do the same thing right in here. I went a little thicker, just a little thicker right in here. And then with the cream top-like ratio between water and paint, Van Dyke brown on the tip of my brush. Now I have a little too much of that paint, so I need to get rid of it. There you go. This is cream top. And from the top, I'm gonna grab this, add this here. So cream top-like ratio. Why is that? It's because I first wetted it, so it was wet on dry with a color. So the three colors: burnt sienna, Van Dyke brown, imidazzle brown, right? So the three browns. And then this became wet. So if I add more color to it, it becomes wet on wet. So I need to adjust the ratio between water and paint. Now this feels fine, but it's not as dark. So I'm gonna use the leftover paint. Feels a little too thick, which would be because I had this cream top-like ratio. So I just diluted it more with water. I think that's pretty good. And then here, same thing, just to make it a little darker. Now, I'm super tempted to actually remove the masking, and I think it's time because right now, like I can't do anything until I see it, like how it looks like. The thing is that if you feel like you need more of that chocolate layer there, then go for it now, because actually here I added 2 layers. So this is what it looks like. But here for this piece, I don't feel like I need to add second layer. If you do need to add second layer, do it now before you remove the masking fluid. So this is a pickup cement eraser. And I do recommend it. It's great. It's like the best tool basically to remove masking fluid for watercolors. So So you just rub it off here. So I'm just gonna, just like an eraser, right? But it's called a pickup cement eraser. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it at art supply stores, online, or even when you go to a store, they should have it. So I'm just removing this masking. The next step is to work on these, not reflections, but the highlights, the highlighted areas, but also the toppings. So it's some walnuts there, right? So I'm going to use a smaller, stiffer brush again, so size 2. First of all, you can do this wet on dry. You don't have to do it wet on wet. So some parts I am going to paint wet on dry and some parts wet on wet. So this is something that I preserved earlier. I am going to wet it first. So I'm wetting it, and then with the tip of my brush, this is drier paint, and I'd say this is like a raw sienna. There's some yellow ochre and quin red actually, and I'm just gonna add a little bit of that. So the more concentrated paint, like over the edges a little bit, but I do want the paint to spread a little bit. So now I just grab some of the yellow ochre. So that's the color, I guess, and then I don't have to do this one wet on wet. I can just add the color like this, and then I'm gonna grab with the tip of my brush, cream top-like ratio between water and paint, and add it to the area where it's already wet. So something like that. So that's the first area. I am going to add some more darks for the shadows there. But for example, what I could do next is find another piece. So let's say this one. So I'm going to wet it. And again, you don't have to wet it. You can just do it wet on dry as well. This is yellow ochre raw sienna, I'd say, and just remember to like not color the whole thing because you need to show there's highlights. And then since this is already slightly wet, some areas are wet, I just grab like this cream top-like ratio between water and paint of the burnt sienna, and I'm just gonna aim it like maybe towards like the bottom. So you choose areas where to apply this color because you don't need it everywhere. And then another one, like let's say here. So just some water, not everywhere, because in some areas I just want to have like this hard edge. Raw sienna, yellow ochre. So raw sienna, yellow ochre, there's tiny bit of quin red. And now I'm gonna grab with the tip of my brush this cream top-like ratio between water and paint of just the burnt sienna. And you know what? There's some more of this topping. So actually, I'm gonna grab this more like a diluted paint. So this is raw sienna, some yellow ochre, quin red, and I'm in wet on dry. I'm gonna travel all the way here, and then I'm gonna clean my brush. I'm gonna wipe it on towel, and this is just a damp brush. So I pulled it a little bit, and then cream top-like ratio between water and paint of burnt sienna, and I'm just adding it towards like the wetter areas. So that's how I go about these toppings, the areas where I can see the walnuts, right, sticking out. Another area, just add water, not everywhere, because you want to have some harder edges and to show that there's some highlights. And then I have yellow ochre, raw sienna, some quin red. I'm gonna go mostly towards like the edges. Clean my brush, and then just push the paint a little bit, and then cream top of the burnt sienna mostly. I say mostly because my color is not like perfectly clean there, because I keep mixing it with other colors. And then let's see, this looks like this would be like my highlight, so maybe this would be another piece of that topping. So this piece, and you can paint more than one at once. These are such small areas. So now yellow ochre, some of the raw sienna, quin red, and let's see, this one has a big highlight, or actually you can't tell which one is what, like on my painting versus comparing to the reference, because everything my sketch is just not accurate, what I'm trying to say. So my sketch is a little different, but somewhat like I can tell like, okay, maybe this one is the one on the right side. So just to get an idea where the highlights are, we just want some of these toppings to have color, because some could be just like really highlighted. There you go, a little bit here. You can also play with colors, and in some areas add just some of the blue violet, for example, too. And then some of the burnt sienna, Go. And then I'm thinking maybe right here, this one. This and here. And these tiny pieces. So raw sienna, yellow ochre, some corn red. And this too. I forgot there's one piece that's sticking out in a way. And then burnt sienna with the tip of my brush. But I could grab a tiny bit of the imidazzle brown too, I'm thinking, because that's the chocolate. And that chocolate goes over a little bit some of these pieces. The idea is to preserve light. So you have like those highlights. And then here, burnt sienna. There, it looks like I preserved so much for the highlights, but I don't need that much. And I will take care of these highlights in just a second. I just want to make sure I have enough of these toppings. So I'm thinking this is colored. There's some over here. I think this was supposed to be a highlight as well. This was supposed to be a highlight. Now what I'm going to do is actually grab this imidazzle brown, Van Dyke brown, some of the burnt sienna. I do want more water because what I'm going to do is going to be wet on dry. So more water, burnt sienna, Van Dyke brown. And what I'm going to do a little more of the imidazzle brown. I'm going to try to separate these pieces here because we have a tree and then we have chocolate. So just to add another layer there. I think that's fine. And the same thing here. So I want this to be more like chocolatey. And so I need to go through this area to kind of separate this highlight in a way. Plus these highlights are like, when you take a look at them, they're very smooth. They need to be really smooth. And then you can go on the inside of these highlights, just like we see that the pattern, the lines. We need to show that as well. So my color is a combo of like the burnt sienna, Van Dyke brown, and I have this burnt sienna, Van Dyke brown, and imidazzle brown, which is like my richest brown. That looks more like an orange brown almost, or reddish brown, however you want to, actually you can say it's reddish brown or you can say it's really like, let's say orange brown. Either way, it's fine. And then here, we want to separate this. So it's about shadows too. So we need to add some shadows. I went a little too far. And what's going on here? So I need to cover this part. So now I'm trying to figure out the shadows too. And this is wet on dry. So you have some pieces that stick out. So please don't worry like about doing it exactly like on your paper because it depends how you sketched it. Maybe you use my sketch. But if you sketched it on your own, then a lot of these areas will look different on your paper. So when you're coloring things, it will just look different compared to my painting. I was doing the sketch by hand, so that's why it's not completely like accurate, like exactly like you see in the reference. And then we have this highlight here. Perfect. We just want to show that these are highlights. So we need some lighter tone on the inside sometimes. So this is more like a water-like ratio on my brush. And then you want to have like lines on the inside of these highlights. So this one already has it, although it's not rich enough. So you just need to add a little color, but it needs to be more like a milk or water-like ratio. So the paint, so I'm not dry brushing, because if you don't have enough water mixed with your paint, then you feel like you're dry brushing. And then you can go through these toppings as well. I think that's the highlight here too. It would be technically, because again, my sketch is very different compared to what you see in the reference image, right? So we can't like compare it exactly like where did I place those toppings. It's kind of like guessing, okay, like this area would be a little darker and so on. And so you can go over some of these toppings because you would have some chocolate going over it too. So just slightly add a little bit of color, not everywhere, just choose like, let's say the bottom side, because it looks like the light is hitting it more from this side, from the top, I'd say, because some of the tops of those toppings, they're more highlighted, there's more light. So that's kind of how I see it, that I would add more light or more shadows from the bottom and preserve more light from the top. And here I have this line I want to create. I already separated this part because I added some shadows. And you can go underneath those toppings too, like this, if you need to add even more shadow from the chocolate. And then I'm just going to go through it a little bit, and then now wet my brush, grab the same 3 colors very quickly. This is between water milk like ratio, and I'll continue adding another layer here, which is the chocolate piece that's like underneath the cookie almost. Now I'm going to clean the brush. I placed a little bit of a color here. I'm going to go through this lighter line now by pulling the paint from here, or letting it bleed, I should say, so it's not so light there. And I could do the same thing, let's say a little more of the imidazolam brown, but this is transparent layer, and just pull it a little bit through so it's not so white. And then with that milk-like ratio between water and paint, the 3 colors again together, it's just lines. When you take a look at it and you start studying like the reflections and all the little pieces, it's like adding tiny lines like this. And that's what gives the impression that those are like this is chocolate, first of all, like, so you can tell it's chocolate, but it's the light. We need to show that there's light. So this actually needs to be shadowed. So the 3 colors together, and I'm just going to make it a little darker right here. So yes, one thing is to preserve the light and also work with the light values, but also number 2 is to add enough of those shadows. And let's see, I feel like, actually this is pretty fine, like it's pretty good now. I was thinking to color these on the inside, but really there's not much, there's no need to do that. So here I'm just going on the inside a little bit, and I'm gonna color this part, just to add a little layer here. And then if you really want to color it, you would grab a little bit like a very light value of a color, you would travel through it a little bit, and then with a damp brush you would soften it from the top. So then you have a little bit of that brown, tiny bit, but it's a very light value as you can see. And then water, just water. There you go. So just a little bit, just to have some color from that chocolate in there. But to be honest, that's pretty much it. One thing actually I want to show you, because I didn't do it yet, is to make this a little darker right underneath this topping here. So those are the 3 colors together, and this is milk-like ratio between water and paint. So milk-like ratio, I need a little more of the, actually Van Dyke brown, it seems like a Van Dyke brown in there. And just the color here, and then maybe a little bit of a color here. So you can add some dots as well if you want to. I'd say this is almost like vanilla, right? Because you would have like little dots from the vanilla. But here I can maybe add a couple more. I feel like I don't really need to do that. Here actually I should have a little line. Feels like it's either for a shadow or there's that part that's a little darker, just like we have it right here. I think that's pretty good. And then there you go, I'm going to separate it just a little bit. And the same thing here, just to add a little color, kind of like on the outside, almost like a line. Again, just to show that there is that chocolate, but those are small things, and you can decide if you want to work more on it or you're done. All right, I think that's it. So the only thing I could suggest to do more is to maybe add some golden accents, like you could add some gold sparkle or like spots with just gold if you want to. And actually I'm going to show this to you because I have this test piece, and that'll be fun to do it on a test piece. So this is my test piece. I'm going to remove the piece from this class, And I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. What I have here is a gold powder mixed with gum arabic. I have gum arabic and I have this gold. It's just gold powder. So this is what it looks like. So this is the gold powder. So what I did, I first squeezed some of the gum arabic onto this, inside this bowl, and then I put it on the side and I added some water and then I mixed it with gold. So I added some gold powder. Now I need a brush and I need to actually dilute it with water now because I already used it for something else and it dried, but it doesn't matter because we added some gum arabic in there, so you can reactivate it just like paint, and then you can just add some gold accents if you want to, just a little bit of some gold. And that's it. Please let me know if you have any questions, and thank you so much for taking this class with me.